Wrapping up this morning's agenda, we'll be hearing from Rick Antonson from Vancouver. He is the head of tourism there and is internationally recognized for his leadership in understanding the power of a city's brand and how to advance and promote a city's brand to benefit the economy and tourism in a city. But what caught my eye as a guy who grew up in Oklahoma City was the fact that he just wrote a book called Route 66 Still Kicks. Now, I will tell you, if you've never driven Route 66, you probably don't want to. No, I'm kidding, of course. But it is a great way to get a slice of the country. And our speaker actually drove Route 66 and might even make reference to it during his presentation. But really what he's going to talk to us about today is a concept that he is developing and furthering. It's called cathedral thinking. I'm kind of interested to hear more about that. So why don't we bring Rick Antonson to the podium for our last morning speech. Rick? Good.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, last night I spoke on the phone with my wife and I said I had a question. I asked her, did you ever in your wildest dreams see me on stage in New York making a speech? And she said, honey, you're actually not in my wildest dreams. Albert Einstein said that if he had 1 hour to figure out an answer to a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes making sure he started with the right question. So I have a question for you that I've thought about, and it's this. What is it you can begin doing today that would do something, create something that would only benefit future generations? Think about that. What is it you can begin doing today that will only benefit future generations? And hold that thought as we talk about cathedral thinking. Christmas, a couple of years ago, my wife Janice and I were in Edinburgh at St. Mary's Cathedral with perhaps 1,000 or 1,500 other people. 1,000, 1,500, massive, cavernous, gorgeous structure. And after the evening's events, we were walking, we later had a glass of wine, and we got talking about the concept of cathedral thinking, how they would have built that, what would have happened. And the whole notion of cathedral thinking is not new. It's in fact been around for hundreds of years. It had a bit of currency and consideration perhaps 40 years ago, and then the last 10 years began to get written about and talked about. I had absolutely nothing to do with creating the concept of cathedral thinking, but I've become somewhat of an apostle. So here goes. If in the 1400s you were an architect and your community gave you the task of designing a cathedral, you would begin that chore knowing that you would never live to see your design completed and built. Perhaps your grandson would work on the final renderings, but you wouldn't be around. Yet you put great purpose to your chore. If you were a stonemason and you were laying the foundation blocks and the cornerstone, you would do that realizing that you would not live to see that structure grow and grow, but maybe a neighbor's grandchild would work on the final spire as decades later that structure came into being. If you were an artisan and you were gathering and working to prepare the glass and to color it and do the design so that the structure would one day have stained glass windows, that the light would come in and shine on the altar, you'd be doing all of that work knowing that you would not be alive when that final structure had room and they were ready to put in the stained glass windows that you were preparing. But somebody from a future generation would be there, perhaps a grandchild, to do that. Cathedral thinking is about the long term. It's about doing things today that are so important, intrinsically so, but the only beneficiaries are not born yet. It is the one way to keep the living generation tethered to the future. It is about thinking about the long term, knowing that you're making decisions that will unfold in part because of things done by the next generation and by the generation after that. It is putting in place very, very important things. An example, in 1369, New College was built at Oxford. And when they built that, part of it was a large, really important hall with big, thick oak beams built to last. They had pillars and they had these cross pieces, and they were all put there with the long term in mind. About 100 years ago, they were turning to dust and there were bugs in them, and it was a bit of a problem. And so a fellow was assigned to fix this. And he went and met with the Oxford forester. And he said, do you think there's any chance that in that vast forest over there that we've got something that we can use to replace these beams? And reportedly, the forester said to him, we've been waiting for you for 500 years. From generation to generation to generation, the foresters have passed down the knowledge that in 1369, when that building was constructed, that grove of trees over there was planted so that they would be big and strong and ready when you needed to replace the beams and the roof. Cathedral thinking. The cathedral in Cologne was begun in 1284. It opened its doors in 1880. They're hoping the current phase of construction will be completed in 2026. Cathedral thinking shows up in all aspects of city building, of country building, in ways large and small, and many, many of the people who are cathedral thinkers don't realize it at the time, but intuitively, perhaps, they know the importance. Jim Rogers, who is the outgoing chair of Duke Energy, a company known for coal, for other areas, talks about cathedral thinking. He talks about it in terms of wind power and solar power and the early stages of development in those fields. Knowing that they will be viable, they will be sustainable, they will make a difference to our cities and to our countries, but not for 30 years in the way that they need to. But he's a cathedral thinker, and his cathedral thought is invest in this now, not expecting a return now. Invest in this because he's got grandkids, because he sees a better world. Another cathedral thinker that probably wasn't even aware of that term at the time is a fellow named Cyrus Avery. And in the 1920s, he was fighting for better connectivity through roads, through rail, for his city of Tulsa in Oklahoma. And he fought hard because Oklahoma had been bypassed by the railway, bypassed by the major connection routes that were being done for passage of goods. And he became Tulsa's head of transportation. And then he became Oklahoma's head of transportation. And then he worked with like-tasked people around the country of the United States to put in place a highway system that envisioned a numbering that began with highways on the East Coast connecting to the West Coast, and numbering that went 10, 30, 50, all the way down to Mexico. And a grid that had vertical pieces that began with 1, 3, 5. A highway system grid was put in place. But Oklahoma was going to be bypassed. So he fought really hard to get a swath to come down from Chicago to St. Louis, through Missouri, lip into Kansas, and go through Tulsa, his city. He fought for his city. And he fought so hard that he wanted this to be named US Highway 60. He envisioned it as helping commerce. He envisioned it as helping his city. He envisioned it as helping goods get to market. And he fought, and he was so convinced that he'd be able to get US Highway number 60 that he actually put up signs throughout Oklahoma. He actually had brochures created. And then they yanked that back, and the federal government said, you can't have 60. And as a default, he ended up with Highway 66. He had no idea it would become probably the most famous highway in the world. It'd be celebrated in song and on television and in movies, that it would become Route 66. What he was doing was patching together something called Boone's Lick Road with the National Old Trail, putting together private automobile club roads and postal routes and big lobbyists to build this highway where people at the bicycle clubs. He was putting together something that he knew future generations would need. The benefits to him were minor, but he could see that 20, 30, 40 years down the road, this would become a main artery. He could not envision all of the uses, but he put his time and his effort into something that was going to help down the road. So his cathedral thought was, let's build a national highway. Let's do something that will bring benefit to future generations. City builders sometimes have those opportunities. In fact, it would be really quite easy to think today that the good city building stuff has already happened, that the time for cathedral thinkers related to cities is past. London has great parks because of people that did things long ago that could not be done today. Try and take away a park in Istanbul. Vancouver has a great park in Stanley Park. New York, Central Park. These are things that you look, and they were put in place by people who could think about the needs for future generations. People who designed view corridors when they were building cities so that you didn't have blockages when you tried to look down a street. People who put in place zoning that restricted the heights or the tenor of the individual construction. They were all cathedral thinkers because the beneficiaries, in many cases, weren't even born yet, and future generations had their lot in life preserved so that they could take decisions based on what they knew down the road. There are great examples of cities that built up during the 50s and the 60s that did not have underground public transportation. But the buildings that went in place, the city planners made sure that they were built on foundations that had certain structure and a certain design because they designed a transportation system underground that they might one day want to build. And in those cities, when it came time to build the subway, they could do it because the buildings built in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s were designed, guided by the city planners, that they could accommodate the tunneling. And one day when it was affordable and they had the critical mass, they could do those things. Those city planners were cathedral thinkers. They were doing things that they weren't around to benefit from. Many of them had passed away, but they didn't lose sight of that. But major task today is with elected officials at the city level, they are without question the closest to the constituents. They are so much closer than federal elected officials or state or provincial elected officials. They are so close and they are so accountable. How do we get civic elected officials to think beyond their tenure, to act beyond their mandate, to not just look at the next election? Much cathedral thinking is left to be done at the city level. And we see it often. We see it, for example, in the Olympic bidding process. Many of the cities who eventually have hosted the Olympics, in fact, bid for them 3 times before they were successfully chosen as the host for the Olympics. That's true for Vancouver, it's true for Montreal, it's true for Salt Lake City, it's true for Los Angeles, Pyeongchang in South Korea, it's true for Oslo, Barcelona. The original bidders in each of those cities took a risk. They launched a bid to host the world in their community and lost. But when it came time for the second bid, it was another generation that built on what the first bid had done. that took all of that talent and all of the things done right and learned from all of the mistakes and submitted a second bid. And when the second bid went in, it failed. In all of those examples, Salt Lake City, Los Angeles, Barcelona, they in fact had at the start cathedral thinkers, many of whom were not alive when the games finally came to their destination. But the grandchildren were. They were there to mount the games, to be a part of it, to make it work and make it a success. Because they had the ideas passed down generation to generation. They lived with visions that sometimes were in the same family. They certainly were in the same community. Cathedral thinkers can be many things, and cathedrals can be many things. The world needs great gathering places. Those turn out to be cities. There's every reason that we can have our cities as great cathedrals in the future. Two thoughts that I think are relevant to the shifting role of the federal government in the United States and many other countries, and the civic governments, and the power and the responsibility and the huge, huge opportunity that now rests with cities. I like to quote someone who personally to me is the most important philosopher to come out of the United States in the last 100 years. Someone we all know affectionately as Snoopy. And perhaps it was looking at federal governments, think Congress, when Snoopy observed that there is no problem so big that it can't be walked away from. And then he shifted. And perhaps it was looking at all of the opportunities in front of cities when Snoopy said, there is no heavier burden than a great potential. Cities have that. I want to leave you with a personal cathedral thought, because as I started with, each of us in this room should have something that we're committed to working on, the beneficiaries of which are not yet born. We take for granted that we can gather like this and have this meeting. There are many, many countries that intelligent, educated people like this, in this number, would not be allowed to get together in the same room. You can probably name 20 countries without thinking very far. So we cannot take for granted that we can have this dialogue, have this debate. Leads to my personal cathedral thought. Like a billion other people on this planet, I'm a grandfather. And Ryan and Declan will grow up in a country where they can move freely from state to state or province to province. And one day they'll have their country's passport, and like dozens of other countries, with that passport they can cross national boundaries and keep exploring, widen their eyes. Why my grandchildren? Why not everyone's grandchildren? There are 216 nations that call this tiny planet their home. Each of us is but one step or two from somebody in every one of those countries. They may be family, it could be a friend, might be a colleague, could be someone we attend a conference with or meet when we're traveling, could be somebody we sit down in a cafe beside tomorrow and strike up a conversation. Travel is the world's synapses. And travel sits on the right hand of peace. Tourism, more than any other industry, takes down the barriers to understanding. It's about bringing people together to share ideas and learn from one another and to celebrate our differences. Tourism is a vital force for peace, and behooves each of us to consider what we can do individually and collectively so that one day every leader in the world shares in our belief the safe passage and the right to assemble are fundamental freedoms for all people. Thank you very much.